Hello, everyone. Happy Thanksgiving break. Unfortunately, this class really moves at a very fast pace. We don't have time to take the entire week off, and so as promised, I'm going to be posting 2 videos this week. This is the first one, and this one is going to cover a little bit of background about Karl Marx, and then I'm going to introduce you, kind of situate him in the broader context of socialist thought in the early to mid 19th century, as he was growing up, as he was starting to begin writing, and then as he was intellectually maturing. I'll give you a summary of the Manifesto of the Communist Party, which is your reading for this week. But then I'm also going to give you a little bit of background on the other pieces that are in your book, the selections. These are all selections of things in the book, in case you decide you want to read further on it, because these texts are very difficult, very dense, and you'll need a little bit of a primer on those. And just kind of hearing the same sorts of things repeated will maybe help kind of lock what are kind of a little bit of dense, jargon-filled ideas for you here. So, okay, let's get started. Okay, so yes, and then there will be a video that I'll post Wednesday where we talk about, we'll finish talking about some of his ideas, we'll critique his ideas, see where they came up short, and then I'll do a very quick crash course on where Marxism went after the death of Karl Marx, because I'm not really going to touch on it in the brief time that we have in the post-war period. So, here we go. So Karl Marx, born in Prussia, another Prussian like Kant. Marx is going to come from a middle-class family of Jewish ancestry, though he never really identified really with his Jewishness. He studied law and philosophy, Bonn and Berlin. This was sort of the intellectual heartland here. He was influenced by the young Hegelians, Feuerbach, who had radical critiques of religion and the state. After completing his doctoral thesis on ancient Greek philosophy in 1841, Marx was not able to find a job in academia, something many even today could sympathize with, and so he turned to journalism. He wrote a lot about political economy, state power. He criticized censorship, the exploitation of workers. His early writings sort of mark the beginning of his break from the idealism of Hegelian thought towards the materialist conception of history that he'll really flesh out and make his own. And so he's going to start collaborating here in the 1840s with Friedrich Engels, whose name is going to appear on a lot of Marx's work as a co-author. He was an industrialist, actually. He was in the cotton business. And he's actually going to kind of be a patron of Marx. So they were both really interested in social inequality, and that really kind of brought them together. So Marx's most famous theoretical contribution is going to be what's called historical materialism. And this is the idea that history unfolds through class struggles driven by material economic conditions. So this was in itself kind of an idea borrowed from Hegel, who we had to very frankly, unfortunately, omit from this survey course. But it's a very fast course. He's very dense. He doesn't have anything real small that I can give you. But in Hegel's terminology, you had a thesis, an antithesis, and out of the conflict, the struggle between them, you have a new synthesis, which would then become the new thesis, and then the process would repeat. Marx argued that the structure of society was determined by its mode of production. So you have an economic base, and everything else you see, the social relations, the political structure, this is a function of the economic base, and this was called the superstructure. So you have the base and the superstructure. So the mode of production, the means of production, the land, the labor, the capital, the relations of production, that was the social relations that governed the economic activity. We don't really think about this kind of stuff today, but I mean, just to take England, for example, Marx was doing a lot of his writing in England. If you didn't show up for work, you could be like jailed for not showing up to work. I mean, it was pretty intense stuff. So from Marx's perspective, human history was characterized by class conflict, whether the transition from feudalism to capitalism, which was essentially that bourgeois section of society, those owners of the means of production, that wealthy class that didn't have political representation and a voice in government, overthrowing the old feudal order of church and nobility. And their form of government was, Republican government or parliamentary government. And then eventually capitalism would be overthrown and replaced by socialism, okay, and specifically communism. And so this would be the workers supplanting the bourgeoisie, the proletariat, to use Marx's phrase. So, during the revolutionary wave of 1848, actually just weeks before the first revolution in France breaks out, they published the Communist Manifesto, which is your reading for this week, and we'll take a look at it. And so I won't go into it here. But after the failure of the 1848 revolutions, Marx settles in London, where he lives pretty much out the rest of his years, sitting in the library. He writes Das Kapital, which I've mentioned, which is 2 volumes. He writes them in the 1860s. The last one, the second volume, isn't finished at the time of his death. They were edited by Engels, but they're very difficult reads. I don't recommend them. I did read them, but I don't recommend them at all. He does have some interesting works, which I mentioned to you in class, but that's not it. I could grab it from the bookshelf somewhere in here. It's huge. So, despite his revolutionary rhetoric and the centrality that retrospectively has been applied to Marx, he had very little influence during his life. His ideas gained prominence after his death. As we're going to see, he was just one of many types of socialists in the emerging ideological space that was the socialist sphere of thought. So, obviously, I'm going to get into more of this on Wednesday, but critics obviously have challenged Marx for what they see as really his economic determinism, and sort of his belief, for example, in the need to bring colonial peoples, that basically that imperialism was good, because in order to realize the highest form of living and social relations, you had to move from agrarian feudal relations to industrial Republican democratic organizations to communism and socialism. And so he believed that, these colonial peoples, it was good that Britain or the German Empire eventually, or the French, were going around and colonizing these people, because it was only through that you could create the structures that were needed to advance the world proletariat. So let's kind of talk more about the socialist currents of the 19th century. So we already talked about this, that industrialization, urbanization, the French revolutions, these are bringing about profound transformations and dislocations in society. And socialism emerges as a critique of industrial capitalism. So, Karl Marx is one who we're obviously focused on, but there were many others. Some of them were utopian socialists, people like Fourier, Saint-Simon, Robert Owen. And these were thinkers who envisioned ideal societies organized around principles of cooperation, communal ownership, moral reform. We talked about how, in many ways, this was harkening back to an old communal vision of society. Remember, we'd all get together and we'd basically decide together, what are we going to grow on our land? How much of it are we going to grow on this part, that part? When are we going to harvest it, etc.? And we talked about how industrial capitalism, while it liberated the workers and made it possible for them to choose their own destiny, make better choices for themselves, to raise themselves up and do all these different things, it also came with the loss of what were the traditional social relations that provided a safety net during times of hardship, which were always right around the corner. So a lot of these early utopian socialists were looking to recreate this in the absence of like a lord, basically, and they set up all sorts of different communist utopia projects, especially in the United States. And so if you're interested, you can find all sorts of interesting stuff about that just by Googling, like, socialist cooperatives in 19th century America. Very interesting stuff. So, apart from this, though, you had, so that would be people like Owen and Fourier. Saint-Simon, meanwhile, he's going to be the Saint-Simonians. They're actually going to be someone who can embrace a figure like Louis Napoleon, Napoleon's nephew, who seizes power in France after overthrowing the Second Republic, which was not terribly popular. They believed that you needed to guide society toward industrialization and development by using a technocratic elite. these are people who were looking back to the sort of enlightened despots and saying, look, if you have a leadership class, a professional bureaucracy, and a leader who can make this transition happen, it will be much more orderly, much more rational, and so that would be like the Saint-Simonians. Proudhon is another one. He's actually the one who declared property as theft. So that's where that comes from. A lot of people associate that with Karl Marx. Proudhon was actually the one who came up with that turn of phrase. All of these guys criticized each other brutally. So something to understand, like this was not friendly. They were all fishing in the same lake, if you want to think of it that way. All of them are trying to create a new gospel, a new social gospel, essentially, to borrow Rauschenbusch's phrase, for the masses, for the urban proletariat working class. And so this is their competition. So they are not, it's always very fractious. So, okay. So that's Marx. So he's in all of, so he's mixed in with all of these other people. Let me see if yes, I did have something on this. So Marx, again, is sort of carving out his own space for himself, saying that, look, this is actually a deterministic process that is a function of developments in economics, and that everything else flows from this. And so there's no point, and you know, you don't want to be utopian and idealist, thinking that you'll go set up shop somewhere away from capitalism, because capitalism is a systematic, is so systematic that it will incorporate and gobble up everything. That's one of his gripes against Proudhon, who idealized small-scale property ownership, for example. Yes, so Marx's contribution really would be transforming socialism really from more of a moral critique of industrial capitalism, which we talked about. It was very tough. It was a very tough situation. You know, picture a Charles Dickens novel, a background there for the living conditions there. It was very bad. It was liberating. Again, I want to emphasize, it was liberating because you now had a choice. You now had a choice, an option. And it was raising the standard of living, but it was very difficult conditions. And but he's turning it into a materialistic theory of political economy. Okay, not just a moral condemnation of the way workers are being treated. He is systematically talking about this as a function of the political economy, of how states are being governed. So, some of the texts here. Your book included a selection of Marx's economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, also known as the Paris manuscripts. He was living in Paris time. These were one of his earliest comprehensive engagements with political economy and philosophy. So he's kind of the reason that they included these is because they make a nice bridge between his Hegelian foundations and where he's ultimately going with like a dialectical materialism here. So, and he spends a good deal of time, the selection of the book talks a lot about his theory of alienation, which we talked about, the workers being alienated from the work that they're doing. We talked about the division of labor and what that does. So, just to review here, alienation. Four aspects he talks about. Alienation from the product of labor. So they're separated from the goods that they produce. The product of the labor is owned by the capitalist and becomes an external object that confronts the worker. Okay. Alienation from the act of production. Okay. The worker is not gaining satisfaction or self-expression from the work. It's just a means to survive, right? They're just getting the money so that they can buy goods. It becomes a monotonous, dehumanizing process, he says. Alienation from the essence of what it is to be human, that essentially humans create naturally as a function of their expressiveness and their creativity, and that in capitalism, this potential is stifled as workers essentially are reduced to instruments of production, severed from their more naturally creative nature. And then alienation from other people. Marx argues that the competitive structure of capitalism pits individuals against one another, eroding social bonds and fostering relationships based on exploitation and self-interest. So this is what he's arguing there, and this is what your book talks about. Marx traces alienation to the institution of private property, which again, we have to think about it like, yes, the Lord or the king, this was all their private property, but it wasn't private property in the liberal sense of you could just sell it and do whatever you wanted with it. You couldn't actually sell your lands in many cases, and you couldn't just give your lands to someone else. There were actual laws governing what you, even as like a duke, could do with your lands. It was, your estate was entailed. It had to go to your firstborn son. Your son could not sell part of the lands. You had responsibilities to the people on the land, etc. So it was their property, but it wasn't private property in the way that we think about it now as a function of the capitalist age. So this is what Marx is arguing here, is that the creation of private property was an alienating force, is what underlies all alienation, because it atomized individuals. So again, this is Marx's idea, and we're going to talk about this next week, or on Wednesday, critiques of this. So, because of course Hegel doesn't talk about anything material. Hegel's he's a German idealist. This is all in the realm of ideas. Marx is bringing it to the here and now. So, the next one that they included in your book was a selection of the German ideology. So this was written just after the Paris manuscripts, and it wasn't even published during Marx's lifetime. But again, it's just they're trying to move you along to see how he's doing here. He's critiquing his fellow inheritors of the Hegelian tradition, the so-called young Hegelians, and so he's critiquing this focus by the young Hegelians on abstract ideas as the primary drivers of history. He's arguing, and Engels with him is arguing, that it's the material conditions of life that are the real foundation of historical development. And the famous quote from this one is, "Life is not determined by consciousness, but by consciousness of life." And they're emphasizing here that the economic structure of society shapes its ideas, culture, and politics. So everything is downstream of the economic base. So, they introduce historical materialism as a methodological framework. Of course, they do this in other places, but this is, if you were reading the works chronologically, this is where you would have first encountered it. And this mode of production, how society organizes labor and production, determines the structure of society, the superstructure. And history is basically depicted by them as a series of stages, defined by that dominant mode of production. So there was primitive communism, early societies without private property or class divisions. Slave societies, marked by the emergence of private property and the exploitation of slaves. Feudalism, dominated by landed aristocracy and serfs. Capitalism, defined by industrial production, wage labor, and the dominance of the bourgeoisie. And he argues that each stage contains internal contradictions, specifically class struggles, which drive historical change and eventually lead to that next stage. So, for Marx and Engels, ideology is just rhetorical justification that those in power use to justify and maintain their dominance. They are not, in Marx and Engels' view, neutral truth, but reflections of the material interests of the dominant class. So, for instance, under capitalism, Marx is arguing that the ideology of free markets and individualism exists to serve and legitimize the power of the bourgeoisie and to mask what he sees as exploitation. So, next chronologically, I just want to confirm this. I believe it is. Yes. Next chronologically, sorry, I think I added one more in here. I did. Yes, okay. Sorry, I just wanted to confirm because I added one more. That was 59, 48. Okay. So next, this one, I'm going to go into this one a little bit more in depth because this was your reading for this week. It's not a terribly difficult text. Like the other texts are very dense. I mean, you got to grab a good cup of coffee and really, sometimes you're going to have to read the sentences a few times. The Manifesto of the Communist Party, which was written in 1848 and published right before Europe exploded, and it looked super prescient because it was this explosion of social unrest by the masses, right, by the proletariat in these cities, students, workers. This is a highly influential document. This is why I chose to have you read it. It also lays out pretty programmatically what their goals are without going deeply into historical dialectic or alienation or all these different things. Because the assumption by Marx and Engels is that you already know something about this if you're a fellow intellectual, and for everyone else, it's just a call to arms, basically. So, and it is a call to arms for the working class to overthrow capitalism, obviously. So, it's broken down into 4 basic sections, so here we go. 1 was the bourgeoisie and the proletarians. So the opening section outlines the materialist conception of history at a very surface level and illustrates this as the central dynamic of the class struggle, all historical progress being driven by the oppressor versus oppressed class. Again, he talks about feudal society, characterized by the struggle between feudal lords and serfs, and the rise of capitalism, where the bourgeoisie, sort of using the lower classes, kind of overthrow and replace the old ruling class with themselves. And he argues this is where we've been, this is what's been happening, this is what the French Revolution was about. Capitalism. He actually praises capitalism. He praises capitalism for its revolutionary impact on society, having unleashed tremendous productive forces. I mean, the 19th century, even by midpoint, I mean, again, we've got steam engines, tons of railway tracks, large-scale production, prices falling, goods becoming available, the consumer economy developing, telegraphs. I mean, it's clear that the world is being radically transformed in a way that for centuries, people had been living the exact same way, as I mentioned in class, virtually. And now all of a sudden, man is using capitalism and reason to harness the world. But he argues that all of these, the dissolving of traditional relations, globalized economies, these innovations are creating the gravedigger, that is the proletariat, the working class. Under capitalism, the proletariat suffers exploitation, alienation, and impoverishment. Workers produce value through labor, but that value is appropriated by the bourgeoisie, creating inequality. He argues that this profit, the surplus between what it costs to produce a thing and what you sell it for, that this is appropriation, that this is exploitation. And this is what he's arguing. And that it creates an inequality here. So he does not view the savings and investment and the risk taken by the business owner, by the capitalist. He doesn't take any of that into account. He's following Ricardo's labor theory of value. So, which Ricardo was the next classical economist in line, really behind Smith. If we don't count the French physiocrats, which no one really ever seems to for some reason. Certainly not the level of a survey course. But he argues that there's going to become such a huge gap between the small handful of capitalists who own everything and employ everyone and expropriate all the wealth themselves. There's just going to be this huge proletariat that eventually, because he can already foresee that eventually more and more of society is going to become industrialized, fewer people will be needed on the farms, they'll be gathered into the cities. You'll have these massive amounts of just horribly exploited people and a very few people on the top, and that they're going to rise up and overthrow them. Right? And the failure to anticipate that capitalism would raise everyone's living standards and create these large middle classes. This is one of the great failures of classical Marxism, and the reason that it's virtually abandoned as a realistic mode of political economy pretty early in the 20th century in all but the most backward places, like Russia, ironically, because of course Marx does not think that Marx believes, again, he views imperialism, sorry to go off track a little bit here, but he believes that imperialism is good because it's going to raise these people up to the level at which they can then have communism, industrial communism specifically. So he believes that only the most advanced, industrial advanced societies like Germany, the unified Germany by that point, is where communism is going to come from. Not Russia. Russia's hopelessly backwards, very far away from there. But of course, one of the great ironies is that this is exactly where communism is going to crop up repeatedly. So, in the 20th century. So, second section, the proletarians and the communists. This section is clarifying the role of communists within the broader workers' movement. Marx and Engels are stressing that communists do not form a separate party, but are the party that represents the interests of the proletariat as a whole. So sort of a kind of vanguardism, because the workers are, so ignorant and oppressed, and they just don't understand these things. They need, that revolutionary small vanguard party leadership to lead the way. This vanguard party of intellectual leaders mean to end the bourgeoisie's exclusive ownership of productive property, which they again believe perpetuates the inequality. They're going to end class distinctions, create a classless society. This, of course, also doesn't happen. It just leads to the emergence of a managerial elite. And then global solidarity. The working man has no country. This is a critical idea here. And World War I is going to be a huge blow to the international communist socialist movement, because these leaders, and of course Marx is long dead by this point, but all the socialist leaders are very, very against World War I. They're saying, listen, and I mentioned this in class on, I believe, last Friday. They're saying, look, the proletariat of Germany and the proletariat of Great Britain are just going to be forced to kill each other for the benefit of a handful of the ruling elite in both, and they shouldn't do that. They should refuse to have war with each other. They should recognize that they are all being exploited by the same class, and don't be, confused by these apparent distinctions. But nationalism was far more powerful. Nationalism is the most successful ideology, I would argue, that has ever existed, has ever been created. So, political ideology, and we'll talk more about nationalism next week. I have mentioned it a few times, but so yes, Marx and Engels are also going to anticipate and try and answer some of the criticisms of communism. Fears about the abolition of private property, the dissolution of the family, the destruction of culture. They argue these fears are rooted in just a bourgeois sort of affinity for these things. And that it's kind of like false consciousness, that they think these are universal and important values, but they're just indoctrinated. They don't have a real understanding of what's going on, and that cultural achievements and enjoyments are only accessible to the elite anyway, and that the idea of the family is just this bourgeois creation that is meant to keep the family under the thumb of the patriarch. They have a program, a 10-point program. All of these revolutionaries of the 19th century are going to create programs. They have this is what we're going to do. Abolition of inheritance rights, progressive income taxes, centralization of credit and communication under state control, free education for all children. And they're going to, these are going to help them realize communism. And then they believe that ultimately, in the final stage of capitalism, that the state itself would just sort of disappear, and you just have these self-governing cooperative communes. So, of course, section 3, I mentioned this, there's a lot of backbiting, a lot of fighting. They spend a whole section critiquing their fellows, arguing against the other various socialist alternatives of their time, because, and they reject all of them, of course. Some of them are reactionary socialism, feudal and aristocratic socialism. They are saying these people aren't like us. We want to lead you into a future. They want to take you essentially back into the past, where they're going to recreate the traditional social hierarchies under capitalism, right? But just without such its hard edges. And I would argue that this is kind of exactly what is produced in the German Empire, the Second German Empire, when it's created in the 1860s and 1870s. Then they critique petty bourgeois socialism, so-called. This is middle-class socialism. These are the compromisers. They're seeking to preserve pre-capitalist modes of production. They don't want to have big business and stuff, but Marx recognized that the scale of industrial capitalism is something that can benefit everyone. So they do want that. And then, of course, the utopian socialists. They have no time for people like Fourier and Owen, because they're proposing these idealistic blueprints for society without, Marx and Engels believe, understanding the material conditions and class dynamics that drive historical change. And so they're basically useless scribblers in their mind. So the proletariat, for Marx and Engels, is a revolutionary agent of change, and the dictatorship of the proletariat will essentially be ruled by a democracy of the workers, who are, by this point, the majority in society. because capitalism is going to create a totally proletarianized society, they believe. Industrial capitalism. So, they spend a little bit of time talking about the position of the communists as opposed to the existing parties. Initially, in the 40s, they're actually calling for the communists to form alliances with progressive parties, with the goal of overthrowing the bourgeoisie and establishing a proletarian state. Eventually, this is a source of huge contention, but eventually there's going to be a hardcore group that split off from this, and Lenin is going to be an inheritor of this tradition. Lenin, of the Russian example, is going to completely reject any kind of compromise with socialist deviationists and, you know, all the different things that they call them. So, it's very famous. This is a very, very famous piece of political economy. Of course, I had to include it. My own feelings about Marx notwithstanding, it's just too important. So there you have it. I do have the contribution to critique on political economy, which came 10 years later, so I'll real quickly do that. If you have specific questions about, I'm sorry. If you have any specific questions about anything in the Communist Manifesto, I'd be happy to answer them. You can email me or you can ask me Monday when we meet. I have no objection. Monday will sort of be kind of bridging us up to Nietzsche there, and so we have time for that. Again, the Communist Manifesto is sort of a primer, a good primer, because it lays out, at least on a superficial level, on a surface level, all the different things that Marx had been developing by that point in time, and then you have all the other pieces of work that are the selections that are in the textbook, if you want to take a deeper dive into any of these specific topics. So that's why the Communist Manifesto is useful. It's not long. I think the version in your books obviously depends on the size of the page and the print and stuff. I think the version in your book is like 8 pages long. So the last one I have for you here. Marx's contribution to the critique of political economy. This was 1859. So he's kind of laying the groundwork here for Capital. Okay? Because he's critiquing what he views as the inadequacies of classical political economy, particularly the contributions of Adam Smith, to a much lesser extent David Ricardo, who had identified some problems with what he felt problems with Adam Smith. So Marx, again, is going to begin by asserting that material conditions are what drive transformations. He's going to really spend a lot of time developing this idea, labor as the source of value. So, this was something that the Ricardian theory of labor as value. Marx, however, is going to say, okay, David Ricardo, I agree, but I think you're being inconsistent in your application of the labor theory of value. Because you can't reconcile it, he thinks, with observable phenomenon like the divergence of market prices from labor prices. And again, this is just something that Menger and the Austrians will later help to clarify. But Marx is going to attempt to resolve these contradictions by introducing this concept of labor power, quote, labor power. Labor power is the capacity to perform work which is sold by the worker to the capitalist. And so this distinction allows Marx to explain surplus value as the result of the exploitation of labor, which he feels is the concept, the critical concept that's missing from Ricardo. So, yeah, I don't know that I want to say a whole lot else about this. Yeah, because again, he's very laudatory of Ricardo. I'll go into some of this. So Ricardo, some of the things that Ricardo had observed about Adam Smith, which we covered Smith, but essentially there's a tension that Ricardo identifies between rising wages and falling profits, and Ricardo recognizes that capital accumulation can lead to diminishing returns and to crises, but he doesn't really have any framework for explaining them. And so Marx just says, look, I can explain these things here. That capitalism's drive for profit leads to overproduction of goods that can't be sold, and that this produces crisis as then people are laid off and the economy stagnates and, you know, growth slows or reverses. Marx also observes the tendency towards monopoly capitalism. That is, that they want to use, this is actually a little bit far-sighted, he recognizes the tendency for capitalists to want to constrain competition. And this was something that Smith himself had noted, that, you know, if guys get together, they'll, you know, if a bunch of shoemakers get together, they'll have a tendency to want to try and fix the price of shoes maybe, but one of them will cheat by underselling the other. That's why cartels generally fall apart. But Marx is observing that capitalism, by producing competition, this lowers the rate of profit, and that this seems to be a contradiction here. He's going to build on all of this stuff in Capital, but this is where he introduces his idea of, this is where he really expands upon his ideas of surplus value, labor power, and sort of the problems that he views in the classical economists, especially Smith, but to an extent also Ricardo. So on Wednesday, you'll get another video talking about a couple more points of Marx, a couple that I find like relatively interesting, particularly his study of the politics and transformation of France, which I've written extensively about. We'll go over the various shortcomings of Marx's work that I haven't already talked about, what happened to Marxism following Marx's death. Don't forget to do your pretest and to get that turned in at some point before we meet a week from now. That's next Monday. And don't forget also to have a terrific week and a happy Thanksgiving, which I will wish you again when I post the next video on Wednesday. All right. Thank you all. I look forward to seeing you all next week. Have a great rest of the night.